Carl Jung made a discovery that he called dangerous, not because it revealed some dark occult secret, but because it explained why certain people end up isolated, exhausted, and unable to function in normal society despite being completely sane. In his clinical practice during the early 20th century, Jung encountered individuals who possessed what he termed differentiated perception, an ability to read micro-expressions, detect hidden emotions, and perceive unconscious patterns that escaped everyone else around them. These people could walk into any room and immediately sense who was lying, who was in pain, who harbored secret resentments, who wore masks to hide their true nature. To most observers, this sounds like a remarkable gift, perhaps even a superpower. But Jung documented something deeply unsettling. These individuals with heightened perception didn't thrive. They suffered. They couldn't engage in small talk because they saw through every social facade. They couldn't maintain friendships because people felt exposed and uncomfortable around them. They couldn't hold employment because their presence disrupted the unconscious agreements that keep groups functioning smoothly. And here's what makes this discovery so profound and so relevant right now in our current moment. Jung realized he wasn't treating pathology or mental illness. He was observing what happens when unconscious reality becomes too conscious, when someone sees clearly in a world that depends on collective blindness to function. These people had essentially outpaced the collective consciousness of their time. And that gift, that curse, that dangerous ability to perceive what others cannot or will not see, comes with psychological costs that society still doesn't understand over a century later. If you ever felt like you see things others miss, if you've experienced a strange isolation that comes from perceiving patterns everyone else seems blind to, if you've wondered why your clarity seems to push people away rather than draw them closer, what you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you understand your own experience, and why Jung considered this one of the most important and dangerous phenomena in all of human psychology. Let's begin by understanding exactly what Jung meant by differentiated perception, because this term has been misunderstood and diluted in popular psychology, reduced to vague notions about intuition or sensitivity, when Jung was describing something far more specific and far more consequential. In his groundbreaking work, Psychological Types, published in 1921, Jung laid out a framework for understanding how different individuals process reality, and he made a crucial distinction that most people overlook. Differentiation, in Jung's technical language, means the separation of parts from a whole, the ability to distinguish one psychological function from another, to perceive discrete elements rather than experiencing everything as an undifferentiated mass. An undifferentiated person, Jung explained, experiences thinking mixed with feeling, sensing confused with intuition, everything blurred together in an archaic condition where clear perception is impossible. But some individuals, through either natural disposition or intensive psychological work, achieve what Jung called highly differentiated perception. They've separated the psychological functions. They can think without emotional contamination, feel without sensory confusion, intuit without fantasy interference. And this creates an extraordinary capacity to perceive reality with a clarity that most people simply cannot access. Jung wrote that this capacity allowed individuals to detect unconscious patterns, micro-expressions, and unspoken emotions that most people overlook, essentially seeing through constructed reality that societies depend upon to maintain cohesion and stability. Now here's where it becomes dangerous. And this is a part that Jung emphasized in his clinical notes, though he was careful about how publicly he discussed it. Societies function through unconscious agreements, through collective lies that everyone tacitly accepts, through social masks that people wear and that others pretend to believe are genuine. We agree not to notice certain things, not to speak certain truths, not to acknowledge certain realities. This is a malicious conspiracy. It's how human groups create the stability necessary for cooperation and survival. But the person with differentiated perception cannot participate in these unconscious agreements because they see right through them. They notice the micro-expression of contempt beneath the smile. They feel the rage simmering under the polite conversation. They sense the manipulation in the friendly gesture. They perceive the lie the instant it's spoken. And unlike most people who might vaguely sense something is off but override that sense in favor of social harmony, the differentiated perceiver cannot unsee what they see, cannot unknow what they know. Jung documented this phenomenon meticulously in his patient files. One case in particular, from 1913 during his own psychological crisis after breakup with Freud, involved a woman who embodied this phenomenon so completely that Jung considered her case foundational to his understanding. She could walk into any room and immediately sense the psychological atmosphere with devastating accuracy. Jung wrote in his notes that the patient displayed an extraordinary capacity for perceiving unconscious content in others, but this faculty appeared to cause her considerable distress rather than advantage. She couldn't engage in small talk, couldn't keep a job, couldn't sustain friendships, not because she was disordered, but because her perception stripped away the social fabric that held others together. People instinctively withdrew from her presence because being around her felt exposing, uncomfortable, like standing naked under harsh light. And this is the first danger that Jung identified, what he called social destabilization. Societies depend on unconscious agreements, on what we don't say, what we ignore, the lies we collectively maintain, and the person who sees through them destabilizes the whole. They become the child who points out that the emperor has no clothes, except unlike the fairy tale where everyone then acknowledges the truth. In reality, the group turns on the truth teller, labels him as a problem, excludes him, sometimes destroys them to preserve the comfortable collective illusion. Jung saw this pattern repeated throughout history in myths, in religious texts, in cultural narratives. The prophet is exiled. The truth teller is burned. The one who sees clearly is cast out, not because they're wrong, but precisely because they're right, and their rightness threatens the unconscious structures that hold the collective together. The second danger Jung identified is even more psychologically devastating than social exile, and is what he termed existential isolation, or what we might now call living in a different reality altogether. This isn't just loneliness in conventional sense, missing companionship, or feeling socially disconnected. This is something far more profound and far more destabilizing to the psyche. When you perceive reality at a fundamentally different level than those around you, you're not simply alone, you're living in a different world entirely. Imagine trying to have a conversation about color with someone who sees only in black and white, except you're the one seeing color, and everyone else is convinced that their monochrome perception is the full spectrum of reality. You point out the reds and blues and greens, and they look at you with confusion or concern, suggesting perhaps you're imagining things. Perhaps you need help. Perhaps something is wrong with your perception. Eventually, you stop mentioning the colors you see because it only creates disconnection and makes you seem unstable. But you can't stop seeing them, and so you live in this strange double consciousness, navigating a rich multidimensional reality while pretending to inhabit the flat monochrome world everyone else believes is all there is. This is the existential isolation of differentiated perception, and Jung understood that it doesn't just create psychological discomfort, it can fracture a person's sense of reality itself. Because human beings are profoundly social creatures, we co-create reality through shared perception and collective agreement about what's real and what's not. When your fundamental perceptions diverge radically from the collective consensus, you face a terrible choice. Either you doubt your own perception, gaslight yourself, convince yourself that what you see isn't real, that you're imagining patterns that don't exist, that you're being paranoid or oversensitive or crazy. This path leads to profound psychological fragmentation, to splitting off your perceptual capacity, to dissociating from your own knowing. Or you trust your perception. You hold what you see even when no one else sees it, even when doing so means complete social isolation and being labeled as disturbed or delusional. This path leads to a different kind of fragmentation, a separation from the human collective that can feel like being the only conscious person in a world of sleepwalkers. Jung himself experienced this existential isolation intensely during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious between 1913 and 1919. He was perceiving psychological realities, archetypal forces, collective unconscious dynamics that had no framework in the scientific psychology of his time. His mentor Freud had rejected his ideas. His colleagues thought he was having a psychotic break. He wrote in his autobiography about the profound loneliness of this period, noting that he was seeing things about the human psyche that no one around him could see or validate. Jung stressed that not everyone in society lives and thinks on the same level of consciousness, writing that the population consists of different historical layers, with some people psychologically living in 5000 BC, while relatively few have reached the level of consciousness possible in our time, and even fewer belong to future millennia. making them anachronistic in their own era. This is a stunning observation when you sit with it. Jung is saying that consciousness itself evolves, and that at any given moment in history, people exist at wildly different levels of psychological development. Most are operating from consciousness structures appropriate to earlier eras. A few have achieved the consciousness level of their current time, and an even smaller number have consciousness that exceeds what the collective is ready for, making them evolutionary outliers. Consciousness pioneers who are essentially living in the future while surrounded by people living in the past. If you're one of these consciousness pioneers, your daily experience is of perceiving patterns, dynamics, and truths that are invisible to those around you. You see the shadow material people project. You notice the unconscious motivations driving behavior. You recognize the archetypal forces playing out in personal dramas. You understand the systemic dynamics that create individual suffering. And you cannot find anyone to share this perception with because you're literally seeing a dimension of reality that doesn't exist yet in collective awareness. This creates what Jung called not just loneliness, but existential exile, a fundamental separation from the shared human reality that most people take for granted. The third danger Jung identified is perhaps the most insidious because it operates at such a deep psychological level that most people with differentiated perception don't even recognize it's happening until they're already devastated by it. Jung called this phenomenon participation mystique, using a term from anthropology to describe a state where the boundaries between self and other become dangerously permeable, where you absorb so much of others' unconscious material that you lose all sense of your own separate existence. Here's how this works. When you have highly differentiated perception, you're constantly taking in information that others miss. You're reading emotional undercurrents, sensing psychological patterns, perceiving shadow dynamics. This information doesn't just stay at the cognitive level as interesting observations. If you're genuinely perceiving at the level Jung described, you're feeling these realities, experiencing them almost as if they're your own. You walk into a room where someone is secretly furious, and you feel that fury in your own body. You interact with someone projecting their shame onto others, and you feel contaminated by that shame. You're in a group where unconscious anxiety is rippling to the collective field, and that anxiety floods your nervous system. Over time, if you don't have extremely strong ego boundaries and sophisticated psychological skills, you start to drown in other people's unconscious content. You're carrying emotions that aren't yours. You're processing shadow material that belongs to others. You're experiencing psychological states that have nothing to do with your actual life. And the most dangerous part is that you can't easily distinguish what's yours from what you absorb from the collective, because it all feels real, all feels like it's happening to you. Jung saw patients who had essentially dissolved into the collective unconscious, who had lost capacity to maintain a separate self because their perceptual abilities had overwhelmed their ego structure. They were like psychic sponges, soaking up everything around them with no filter, no protection, no way to discharge what they'd absorbed. Absorbing too much of others' unconscious material leads to participation mystique, dissolving into the collective, and losing all sense of self, a psychological state that can manifest as severe depression, chronic fatigue, identity confusion, or what might be misdiagnosed as borderline personality disorder when it's actually a crisis of psychic boundaries. Modern neuroscience has begun to provide a biological explanation for this phenomenon through research on mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that action. Some individuals appear to have hyperactive mirror neuron systems, creating an almost involuntary resonance with others' emotional and psychological states. But Jung understood this decades before neuroscience discovered mirror neurons. He knew that some people are simply built to be more permeable to others' psychic content, and that without proper training and boundary development, this permeability becomes pathological. The person with differentiated perception is constantly navigating this danger. They're taking in vast amounts of psychological information, feeling deeply into others' emotional realities, perceiving unconscious dynamics that those involved don't see. And all of this creates a tremendous psychic burden. It's exhausting to constantly process not just your own psychological material, but also the unintegrated shadows, denied emotions, and unconscious complexes of everyone around you. It's overwhelming to feel the collective anxiety, rage, grief, and terror that ripples through human groups. And it's destabilizing to lose track of where you end and others begin, to forget which feelings are actually yours and which you absorb from the psychic atmosphere. Jung emphasized that this third danger is what ultimately breaks many people with differentiated perception. They don't fail because they can't see clearly. They fail because they see too much and absorb too much and carry too much until their own psychic structure collapses under the weight of all they've taken in. They become what Jung called wounded healers, people who understand suffering intimately because they've absorbed the suffering of the collective, but who are themselves broken by the very empathy and perception that could have been their greatest gifts had they learned to manage them consciously. Now we arrive at the crucial question that Jung spent much of his career trying to answer. If differentiated perception is so dangerous, creating social exile, existential isolation, and psychic dissolution, does that mean people with this capacity are simply doomed? Are they evolutionary mistakes, psychological anomalies destined for suffering? Jung's answer was a resounding no, and the solution reveals why he's considered one of the most important psychologists who ever lived. Jung believed there were only two possible outcomes for individuals with differentiated perception, and the difference between them determines whether this capacity destroys you or transforms you into something extraordinary. The first outcome is what we've been describing: destruction through isolation and overwhelm. The person sees too much, absorbs too much, cannot find others who validate their perception, cannot maintain boundaries against collective unconscious, and eventually breaks under the psychic burden. They may withdraw completely from society, develop what looks like mental illness, self-medicate to numb their perception, or in the worst cases end their own lives because the isolation and overwhelm become unbearable. This is a path of unconscious relationship to the gift of differentiated perception. But Jung discovered there was another path, transformation through integration, and this is where his genius truly shows. He developed an entire psychological framework, what he called the individuation process, specifically to help people with differentiated perception survive and eventually thrive by learning to relate consciously to their capacity rather than being overwhelmed by it. The first step Jung identified was recognition, learning to separate what belongs to you from what you've absorbed from others. This sounds simple, but it's incredibly difficult in practice because when you're in participation mystique, everything feels like yours. The rage you picked up from the angry person feels like your rage. The shame you absorbed from projecting narcissist feels like your shame. The anxiety rippling through the collective field feels like your personal anxiety disorder. Recognition requires developing what Jung called the observing ego, a part of consciousness that can step back and witness your own psychological processes without being identified with them. You learn to notice when an emotion or thought suddenly appears that doesn't match your actual circumstances. You begin to recognize the felt sense of absorbing someone else's content versus experiencing your own genuine feelings. You develop a capacity to track when you're perceiving others' unconscious material versus processing your own shadow. This is sophisticated psychological work that requires either intensive therapy with Jungian analysts or years of dedicated self-observation through practices like dream analysis, active imagination, and shadow work. The second step is what Jung called shadow integration, and this is where most people with differentiated perception get stuck, because it requires doing something that seems counterintuitive and even dangerous. You must acknowledge in yourself the very qualities you observe in others, even the disturbing ones, even the ones you judge as bad or wrong or evil. Here's why this matters. When you see someone else's rage, manipulation, cruelty, or selfishness with differentiated perception, there's a temptation to position yourself as an enlightened observer who's above such base behaviors. You're the one who sees clearly while they remain unconscious. You're the good one perceiving the bad one. This creates a split, a false dichotomy where you reject those shadow qualities and project them entirely onto others. But Jung understood that this rejection is precisely what makes differentiated perception into a weapon rather than a tool for healing. When you deny your own shadow, your own capacity for rage and manipulation and cruelty, you're using your perception to separate yourself from others, to elevate yourself, to avoid your own psychological work. Shadow integration means acknowledging in yourself the very qualities you observe in others. So perception is no longer a weapon, but becomes instead a source of compassion and understanding. You recognize that the manipulator you see so clearly is showing you your own manipulative tendencies. The narcissist whose emptiness you perceive reflects your own disowned need for validation. The angry person whose rage you feel is mirroring your own suppressed fury. When you integrate these shadows, when you own them as part of your own psyche, something remarkable happens. Your perception stops creating separation and starts creating connection. The third and final step in Jung's framework for transforming differentiated perception from curse to gift is what he called conscious participation, the ability to engage with collective dynamics without being consumed by them, to perceive clearly while maintaining sovereignty over your own psychic space. This is a mastery level, and is where individuals with differentiated perception finally become what Jung believed they were meant to be, what he called consciousness pioneers or culture carriers, people who can help evolve collective awareness precisely because they can see what the collective cannot yet see. Conscious participation means you no longer swing between the two poles of either drowning in participation mystique or withdrawing into complete isolation. Instead, you develop a third position, a way of being present and perceiving while simultaneously maintaining clear boundaries. You can feel into someone's emotional reality without taking on their emotions as your own. You can see their shadow without absorbing it or being contaminated by it. You can perceive collective unconscious dynamics without dissolving into collective. Jung compared this to a skilled psychotherapist who can sit with a patient's darkest material, can feel into their suffering, can perceive their unconscious patterns, but doesn't leave the session carrying the patient's psychological content. The therapist has learned conscious participation, how to be present and perceptive without being permeable, how to serve as a mirror and container without becoming a sponge. This level of skill doesn't come naturally. It must be developed through rigorous practice, and usually through your own psychological suffering that forces you to learn these skills or be destroyed. But once achieved, conscious participation transforms everything. You're no longer isolated by your perception because you've learned to engage with others at the level they're capable of while simultaneously holding your own deeper seeing. You're no longer exhausted by absorbing everyone's unconscious content because you've developed a psychic immune system that recognizes what's yours versus what's theirs. You're no longer using your perception as a weapon to elevate yourself above others because you've integrated your own shadow and recognized the fundamental quality of all humans struggling with unconscious material. And here's where Jung's vision becomes truly profound. He saw these individuals, these consciousness pioneers who had transformed their differentiated perception through recognition, shadow integration, and conscious participation, as essential to human evolution itself. Jung saw these people as forerunners, consciousness pioneers whose suffering was not meaningless, but mirrored what the culture as a whole was not yet ready to face. They're like scouts sent ahead into new territory, mapping terrain that the collective will eventually need to cross. Their role is not to suppress their perception, Jung emphasized, but to learn to carry in ways that make it usable, survivable, and transformative, not just for themselves, but for the culture as a whole. Think about what this means. If you're someone with differentiated perception who's been isolated and suffering, who's felt broken by seeing too much, who's wondered why you were cursed with this capacity, Jung is telling you that you're not broken and you're not cursed. You're ahead of your time. You're perceiving realities that collective consciousness hasn't yet evolved to recognize. And your task is not to dull your perception or to conform to collective blindness, but to develop the psychological skills to carry your perception consciously so it becomes medicine rather than poison. The integration of differentiated perception serves a collective function. When you learn to see clearly without being destroyed by what you see, when you integrate your shadow without projecting it onto others, when you participate consciously without dissolving into collective, you become a living demonstration that this evolution is possible. You show others that consciousness can expand, that perception can sharpen, that humans can learn to see and know more without fragmenting. Jung foresaw that when integrated, this ability can help evolve human consciousness, calling such individuals culture carriers, those who bear wisdom that transforms not just themselves but society. You become what Jung called a bridge between the unconscious and the conscious, someone who can translate the invisible into the visible, who can speak truths the collective isn't ready for, but desperately needs to hear, who can hold space for the shadow material that others deny and project. This is sacred work, Jung believed, and it's the true purpose of differentiated perception. not to make you special or superior, but to make you useful to the evolutionary process that's trying to move human consciousness forward. And here's the beautiful paradox that Jung understood. The more you develop these skills, the less special you need to feel, and the more humble you become, because you recognize that what you're perceiving isn't about you. It's about the collective psyche trying to become conscious of itself. You're just the instrument, the awareness through which unconscious material can be seen and integrated. The danger is real. Jung never minimized that. Seeing what others don't can isolate you, overwhelm you, destroy you if you relate to it unconsciously. But the potential is equally real. That same perception, transformed through recognition, shadow integration, and conscious participation, can become your greatest gift, not just to yourself, but to a world desperately in need of people who can see clearly and carry that seeing with wisdom and compassion. Jung's message was clear. Your gift is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your gift is the burden, and the question is whether you'll develop the skills to wield it consciously so it becomes not a curse, but a contribution to the evolution of human consciousness itself. If you're someone who sees what others don't, who feels the isolation and overwhelm, who's wondered if you're broken or crazy, understand that you're not alone in this experience. You're a part of a lineage of consciousness pioneers that stretches back through human history, people who saw more clearly than their time allowed, and who paid the price for that seeing. But you're also living in a moment where Jung's framework exists, with a path from destruction to transformation has been mapped, where you can learn to carry your perception consciously rather than being broken by it. The choice, ultimately, is yours. You can continue relating to your differentiated perception unconsciously, letting it isolate and overwhelm you. Or you can begin the hard work of integration, of learning to see without absorbing, to perceive without projecting, to participate consciously in collective while maintaining sovereignty over your own psychic space. It's not an easy path. Jung never promised it would be. But it's a path that leads from danger to gift, from curse to contribution, from suffering to sacred purpose. Disclaimer. Discanten disprevairi for educational and informational purposes only and so no be considered a substitute for professional mental health care, psychological treatment, or medical advice. The concept discussed are drawn from Carl Jung's analytical psychology and contemporary research on heightened perception and psychological sensitivity. If you are experiencing psychological distress, social isolation, identity confusion, or symptoms that interfere with daily functioning, please seek support from a qualified mental health professional, preferably one trained in depth psychology or Jungian analysis. The term differentiated perception describes a psychological capacity and is not a clinical diagnosis. Individual experiences vary significantly, and professional guidance is essential for understanding and integrating unusual perceptual abilities in healthy ones that support rather than undermine psychological well-being.